Media theory is considered a very special branch of knowledge inside the humanities, arts and humanities. It is probably not established as an academic field as much, but still we can distinguish, what is media theory and what is not. Media theory maybe was founded by Marshall McLuhan in Canada. We probably have all heard about him and his famous phrase, the media is the message. He was a rather conservative Catholic literary scholar. And in the early 50s, he started to write about the avant-garde techniques that he studied from the 20s and 30s. And he started to see that these techniques were then, in that post-war period, applied to the rapidly growing fields of advertisement, radio, television, film. And he came up with this overall notion of the media, and he started to reflect on that from a very specific arts and humanities perspective. His colleagues, maybe on the other side of the streets, were very much, let's say, the social scientists. They were developing quantitative techniques to measure the audience and to think about how to better reach the public, how to think about public relations, and so on. Marshall McLuhan, on the other hand, was really focusing on the aesthetics of the new media condition that emerged in the 1950s and 60s. So since then, we can see a rise of what we now call media theory. And still, this Canadian school of thought is a very predominant one. Now, since the 1980s, we also have, for instance, a German school of media theory, and probably Friedrich Kittler and others, they are the most well-known names there. And they also come from the humanities, and they have a more materialistic approach. And so they look really at the way the architecture, the hardware is defining our media condition. So this is media theory. Media critics, they are coming probably from another field. But where is criticism coming from? When we look at theater, film, when we look at literature, right? We still see this distinction between the academic thinkers and the more professional practitioners that actually look at works and value them even on a day-to-day basis. People write the critics of the television shows, of the latest films, of a new theater production, and they are now maybe called media critics. And is there a relation between the two? Very often there is not. So we see that the media theory gives us very good, solid overall insights, but the critics are really focused on the content of the specific production or broadcast, whatever they are studying. I am very positive about the potential of social networks, and I'm rather critical of the limitations that the existing social platforms put on the potential of social networking. The problem is that these days we can no longer even distinguish between the social networking and those platforms. The only way to network for us is through these platforms. But let's say if we go back in the history of the internet, which is, long and rich, we're talking about the last, let's say, 25 years, we can see that especially in the beginning, in 90s and even beyond, let's say even up to 10 years ago, we were able to create social networks outside of the influence of these large corporations that facilitate and that own these platforms. And in the past, it was really also important to make the distinction between, let's say, a decentralized network that had no center, a distributed network, which means that it spreads very fast and has many nodes, and a centralized network, right? These days, we only know centralized networks. There are no decentralized networks left anymore. And this is because of the rise of the cloud. The cloud is one of the big the technical reasons why all this hardware, the infrastructure, has been centralized. Even 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people even had, nodes and servers in their house or in their district, right? So we have noticed an unprecedented form of centralization of the infrastructure, and with that centralization also comes a centralization of the power and control over these networks. And it's really questionable if we should, for instance, call the social media that we know still a network. In the past, the internet, the word itself, indicates at something. The internet was a network of networks. Now, can we still say that of today? And when we see that 85% of the traffic is in the hand of just 4 or 5 companies, right? This is no longer a network of networks. The alternative for the social media, we shouldn't look too far. It's not so complicated. First of all, the internet still has the possibility to become again, to go through a renaissance, if you want, of becoming again a network. Why is that so simple? Is because the lowest level of this technology still has a lot of the protocols. And so we can still arrange these social relationships in society on the level of the technical protocols, right? We should not only think about, it's impossible to fight these really big economic powers to be. Maybe that's true, but we should also go back and point at the social and ethical responsibility of the engineers, because it's in the end the engineers who built this and built this for us. And this technical level is still there. And so what we should do is we should kind of regain the power of that very basic level. And we have given away that power. And so the dialogue, with the engineers, the programmers, is very, very essential here. And we see a shift, right? Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the World Wide Web, has in the last couple of years, but even in the last couple of months, even more so, talked about how this step can be made. So there are really, really powerful, influential people who see that the development has gone wrong. For many, this is a $1 million question, how the social media alternatives that are there, how they can grow and get a critical mass. One of the things that we have known, because this development has been going on for at least a decade now, so there is also already a decade of experience with developing, trying out these internet social media alternatives. So we should first of all start to learn from their mistakes, yeah, because a lot of mistakes were made. However, we can also look at some of the successes. We have not only lost a lot of ground, there are also successes, and I want to mention just a few. For instance, the rise of the search engine DuckDuckGo, which is very interesting. It started as an alternative to the Google search engine monopoly. Yeah? I mean, we all know the statistics worldwide. They are okay, except from China. The statistics are overwhelming, right? In one country, it's 95%. In another one, it's here in the Netherlands, it's 98%. Yeah. So this is a how can you beat a competitor who has 98% of the market share? But the people at DuckDuckGo said, yeah, we are confident that if we start to develop this search engine that is not collecting the data of its users and selling it in secret to third parties, right? That if we make that ethical statement, that over time, not only our search engine will become better, because it learns and step by step it becomes better, but also that over the years, more and more people will start to understand that we should not anymore support this very, very flawed and disastrous business model of Silicon Valley, in which we have become the product. And a lot of the stuff is in fact happening behind our backs. We cannot control it. We have no oversight. There's almost no way even for politicians to regulate it, right? So and in the last let's say 4 or 5 years, DuckDuckGo has seen a tremendous growth. I've been using it from very early on, and it's very interesting to see how it can grow and reach that critical mass that you are talking about. Now, for instance, should we talk about the market share of Telegram or Signal, right? In terms of the might of Facebook and WhatsApp, yes, I believe that we should. And there are a lot of possibilities for ordinary users, and over time, people will start to develop them, will trust them, and then the network effect eventually will start to kick in, especially after, there's so many scandals, such as the Facebook scandal with Cambridge Analytica and so on, right? So the one of the problems is with this model is that we need to be patient. Why do we need to be patient? Very simple, because in the Silicon Valley model, this is all backed up by an enormous amount of venture capital that facilitates very, very rapid growth, right? The alternatives will not have that type of money behind them. And so they will not be able to grow so quickly. But we can also say, so what? It will take more time, but we'll get there anyway. I certainly have to balance the two. And the way I personally see and really feel this tension between the activism and the ethical, let's say, point of view, the political statements that I make, and the reality that I need to study. For instance, this tension is I really felt writing my last book, which is called Sad by Design. And in this book, I really study the mental and psychological construction and experience of the young generation that is really very deeply caught into this social media realm of Instagram, of Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, but also a lot of other apps they very often use. Think of Uber, Tinder, Facebook, and so on. Uber, Airbnb, you name it, right? It's a huge collection. If I want to study them, I need to be part of them, right? You cannot study something if you're not part of it. So it's a real dilemma how, for instance, I can study Facebook while it is known and advertised everywhere that I left Facebook in 2010. I need to do both, and that's often a schizophrenic situation, but I'm trying it nonetheless. Sociology sees no responsibility to study social media. Okay, you have sociology. Why is sociology so disconnected from social media, right? Look for any scholar, any sociologist that is leading in this field. We can't find any, right? And this is a problem. One of the, of course, founders of the, let's say, the network society and its thinkers is Manuel Castells, who is, is an urban sociologist. He is coming from urban studies, in much in the same way as Saskia Sassen is. She has an enormous impact still on my work, and I really consider myself a scholar of Saskia Sassen, and so her impact on me and the way we work here is profound. But she's an urban scholar, and so there's also this strange thing happening, that the urban condition and the technologies, they are becoming closer and closer. So a lot of the interesting influences are in fact coming from people who work on the urban condition. But this is not because there is an intrinsic relationship between the two. I don't think that's the case. The problem is that the internet itself is not taken serious in the other disciplines. And also, it's not a discipline itself, right? You can go probably to Moscow and do film studies, or even go to the theater school and do theater studies. Where is the internet school where we can go and study the internet, right? I have just spoken about the speed of change, which is a serious problem for scholars, because this speed turns everybody who study in it into instant historians, right? You study it, and then in a way you're writing the history of it, because the moment it's published, it's already gone, right? It takes me a half a year for a book to come out, and half a year is really fast in the scholarly world, right? So I'm doing my best to bring out my material as fast as possible, but still there's a half a year in between, and in that half a year fundamental things have changed. Okay, but this aspect of internet becoming a invisible infrastructure is an even more long-term problem. Why? Because we all know, we take it for granted. And we don't study electricity. Do you know a lot of electricity scholars? We don't, right? Are we using electricity? I think we do, even when we tape this interview, right? We are absolutely depending on it. It shapes our life. Without it, it's unthinkable that we can have this conversation between Amsterdam and Moscow. But this infrastructure is disappearing. Now, on the one hand, we can really say, okay, this is a corporate strategy, right? Because it's in the interest of large corporations that they themselves are withdrawing. They are withdrawing themselves from the public debate. They are no longer accountable. Yeah. So becoming invisible infrastructure is a part of the Silicon Valley strategy and has long been. Why? For instance, is it the case that this company that we all laugh about, IBM, is becoming, the moment we started to ridicule them and say, well, you know, it's so old-fashioned, etc., they went through the roof. And the more independent, the more invisible they went, the bigger they grew. And even in the last 5 or 10 years, right? Their influence, their size has tripled. Yeah, the same we can now say of Microsoft, right? Very soon, the Microsoft Windows, it will be gone. They will not have an operating system anymore. Who cares, right? They are withdrawing in the realm of the invisible infrastructure, and they can grow there even more. And we already see Google doing precisely the same. Google has had enough of the social media discussions and the fact that they are under constant pressure of politicians and so on, right? They want to close that. They're engineers. They want to disappear. They're ready to disappear, and they know that the moment they disappear, they can grow even faster, right? So, okay, that is the corporate side of becoming invisible. You're outside of the public vision. You're outside of the public debate. There is also a technical side of this disappearance in the infrastructure. Until recently, the internet was primarily known as a technology that was facilitating the communication between people, between you in Moscow and me here in Amsterdam, let's say. However, with the rise of the Internet of Things and the spread of the Internet as a technology into very different fields, the let's say non-human factor is becoming more and more influential and is going to define in a way the internet as a infrastructure logistics included. Think of agriculture. Think of large fields like health, but maybe even traffic control, the whole rhetoric of the smart city, right? So, and that is another reason why the internet is withdrawing, because the moment it is still about a human-to-human communication, we can still relate to it. We can say, well, we have an opinion about, let's say, WeChat or Alibaba, yes or no. Do we want to shop there? We can complain about the monopoly of this or that American firm. We can talk about political control. This is all between humans. The internet, however, is going in a very, very different direction, in which it becomes for ordinary citizens much, much more difficult to understand what's at stake, and the visibility of the internet in everyday life is disappearing. We don't see it anymore. We don't feel it. Mediatization is very much a term that was developed and cultivated in the 1990s. Is it still a valid term, yes or no? This is a little bit questionable, but yeah, if you have a very, very broad definition of media, of course everything becomes media, and then it's fine. If you want to become a little bit more specific about it, it's probably quite problematic, because the term tries to cover all, and then it covers nothing. So this is a problem. A similar problem we, by the way, see now with a term that is very close, and that is the term digitization. There's a digitization of everything happening at the same time. And very often people, in fact, talk about the mediatization, but they mean the digitization, for instance. And then there's another aspect, and that is maybe that the fact that everything becomes networked, everything becomes connected. Right? These are from machines to machines, from sensors to other sensors. Right? We see that the world is becoming networked, that is becoming connected, and all these things are happening at the same time. The mediatization is definitely there. In the past, maybe in the 90s, we were speaking about multimedia. I don't know if you remember that that term. It meant that, for instance, text, video, and audio are connected, right? These days, we almost forget that because, of course, we take for granted that they are connected, right? So, and in the same way, we should look at a term like mediatization. In a way, this is already taken for granted. Over the last decades, we've seen definitely a sharp decline of the amount of people that work in the media industries with a journalist background. And this is because of the automation of the content production. In part, this is delegated also to, let's say, the citizens. Everybody can now produce a video. There's a lot of this so-called user-generated content. And since the 90s, there is this crisis of journalism simply because of the Silicon Valley strategy that this content is being offered for free. From very early on, it was said, the network is just generating this content for free, and we don't want any revenue model built into the network in a way that professional content producers can make a living out of that, right? And so, and this was a conscious decision in the architecture of those networks, right? This is not a natural phenomena. These decisions were made in very strategic places. That there was no place for the professional content producer in this media landscape, which is strange. But anyway, we can talk about that in historical terms. Right now, we are faced with the consequences of that. Now that these systems, these network architectures, have become the dominant ones. So in the dominant media system, there is no place for the professional content producer. So there are still places outside of it where journalists work. So journalists are pushed to the margins, and they can still work in the few places that are left. A few television channels, a few newspapers, a few radio stations, right? But this is not the core of the internet. These are peripheral places that still have their own distribution systems that more and more depend on the internet, but have no say about how the internet architecture itself looks like. Okay, so this is the situation. Then Facebook and Google come in and they create a revenue model of their own through advertisements. They take away the advertisement revenue from the existing media, centralize it, and really optimize it also in an unprecedented way, right? We can now know precisely that 11,633 people looked at this ad. In the past, this was impossible. We could only guess. We could do some statistical analysis and some questionnaires, but we had no idea. These days, everything is quantified. And this quantification depends on this centralization of this advertisement world, which then also means that the revenue of those advertisements do not go back to the producers, right? So there's a cut, a very hard cut between the people who produce the content and the related advertisements. There's no link between the two. Sometimes there is, of course. We now know that there is a handful of so-called YouTube influencers that somehow try to get some of the revenue of the people who directly look at their YouTube channel, right? So yes, there are a few models, but compared to the overwhelming sum, the overall sum of those advertisements, it's almost nothing. So we should really try to claim and demand a redistribution of those sources of income. And this is going to be a tough battle, but we need to do that if we want to secure the future of journalism, because the amount of journalists on the periphery is still shrinking. And there is another problem attached to that, is namely that because of the let's say, the decline of the status of the journalists, many more journalists are being killed. So this is the problem is also that the ones that are that remain are becoming more and more vulnerable, and this is my biggest concern. Investigative journalism is a very serious long-term job. People work on cases for many years, and they do that often without many people knowing. Their visibility is also often necessarily not there. So we have to trust that they work for many years on a specific case. Let's say finding out a mafia case or certain financial flows, real estate deals, deals with drugs or weapons involved. Often this work is quite tricky and straight out dangerous. So this work is invisible, but is very, very valuable to society at large. And its rhythm is completely contradictory and opposite to the real-time work on the social media, right? Investigative journalists, they are using the social media often, to study it. So it's not that they are not part of it. No, definitely, especially these days, they heavily depend on it. But for them, the social media is a source. And often it's a source which produces a lot of very small pieces of the puzzle. So you need to be on the social media a lot, and then you kind of, collect all these small parts, while you maybe as a researcher, as a journalist, are not visible yourself. You're not necessarily participating in it, and so you're collecting it, and then after a long time, very often in collaboration with others, you publish the results, and yes, when the results are published, yes, you are incredibly visible, and you will have a real impact. So the difference there is especially one of the rhythm, and the rhythm of the investigative journalism is very slow. And that's why you cannot compare it with the blogger who just writes something and expects a number of likes in the hours after the posting. This is a complete different thing. And also the financing of it is completely different. A lot of the bloggers, they may depend directly or indirectly on the advertisement and the support on the social media platforms. The investigative journalist cannot depend on that. We know that very often they do rely on internet money, but then it is crowdfunding money. Crowdfunding money that comes in and then secures that this or that person or group can work for a number of months on a case. The investigation into a case requires a certain dedication and concentration. And of course it is a bit like doing the detective work. There it is important to look at any possible trace. So the investigative journalist, while being on a case, cannot and should not see the social media as a distraction, as something that is an entirely different world, where there's only trolls and people, you know, who make a lot of kind of noise. And no, this is not. These days, the social media is our social reality. And so it means that if you are investigating something, you will enter that social reality. And in today's world, it means that you enter the world of the social media as well. You cannot just put it aside and say, now I'm working on an important case, right? This or that, whatever it is. And then, yeah, I'll leave all those ordinary people, etc., a little bit on the side. No. This distinction today can no longer be made. However, we can still, struggle, as every individual does, with our own distractions. And this is almost a human, a universal condition. Especially investigative journalists, but also academic researchers, need to balance this distraction that they have, which is a human condition, and be focused on what they need to do, and not look down on the social media at the same time.